This is my novel, Harm's Place. I wrote it. And it came out this month, and it is actually doing incredibly well, even with people who don't watch my content. I had the #1 spot on the drive-thru fiction bestseller list for like 2 weeks. It's a sci-fi riverboat mystery, not quite a space western. It doesn't venture off planet into actual space. But the planet we are on is very much not Earth. The very first thing down in the video description is a link to the drive-thru fiction site. I would very much appreciate if you could take a look and maybe buy it, this book that I really actually wrote myself. And when this video airs, it will have been my birthday the Sunday before, so it would be an immense gift for both of us if you got a copy. But now to our scheduled programming, The Wildsea. First thing I'll say to lure you in is this: if you like the setting of One Piece, there is a good chance you're going to like The Wildsea. I personally don't really like One Piece. I know, controversially, owed to the fact that it is animated, and I cannot consume animated media that is not comedy. But I do love The Wildsea precisely because of its many One Piece-esque elements. Because as a kid, I loved it. I loved One Piece. I even went as Zoro one Mardi Gras, and if I didn't have this particular issue with animation, probably I would still be enjoying the hell out of it. The Wildsea is a recent pen and paper role-playing game that emerged from the forged in the dark game design philosophy that's taken gaming by storm these past few years. Though ultimately it plays nothing like Blades in the Dark because it's not about heists, it's about sailing. Sailing on the canopy of a world-encompassing sea of gargantuan trees called ironroots, that is. The eponymous Wildsea, effectively an ocean that you can climb down into without drowning, though you still might die. The reason the world is like this is an apocalypse that occurred about 300 years ago when a mysterious substance called Krezerin appeared, just sort of a purplish golden turbo-mutagenic toxin that smells bitter, sweet, and, you know, like Krezerin. There's just something about it that nobody can describe, but everyone can recognize. It's unknown where Krezerin came from. Perhaps it came from the trees themselves. They sure seem to be swimming in the stuff, but it mutated all manner of plant life, creating a rolling tide of greenery that rapidly engulfed the entire world. And when I say rapidly, I mean like within a year. This was a whole world that existed where everything was normal, and then within 12 months, the entirety of it was world-spanning forest kilometers tall. Krezerin also mutated animals and fungi, presumably also every kind of microorganism, to instantly create an unimaginable variety of impossible life. Adaptations that would never have evolved naturally. Hybrid species. Gangly bison with hands instead of hooves. Frogs the size of watermelons with piercing fangs. Pack-hunting blends of shark and macaw. Intelligent raccoons that use rudimentary tools as weapons. And this is the ordinary stuff. This setting is full of supernatural phenomena that would be considered outright magic in many settings. So you have ghost-devouring chameleons, thought-stealing mosquitoes, and phase-shifted hummingbirds whose song will infuriate you enough to kill your lifelong friends. Even the rocks and the clouds were mutated by Krezerin. It's toxic, yes, it numbs and burns the skin, but it's also a base, natural force of pure potential, concentrated essence of the wild, to put it in werewolf terms, full of energy that can be used by living things. Imagine if plants could metabolize nuclear gasoline. That's kind of the power of growth that is in this stuff. Civilization, though, died almost completely in this apocalypse. I mean, what was it supposed to do? Adapt to this? The only communities that were able to keep the very ground on which they stood were the most isolated backwaters on the peaks of the tallest mountains, and they were woefully ill-equipped for the surge of refugees literally running for the hills. As a result, almost nothing is known of pre-Verdant civilization. It may have been primitive or highly technologically advanced, probably some mix of both. On the Wildsea, technologically advanced items are manufactured here and there, other times found and of questionable origin. You will find clubs and spears and baskets, but also guns and occasionally radios, even cybernetics, though whether these things are fueled by magic or technology is neither clear, nor does it matter. A fundamental element of gameplay is the concept of arcanautics, which is neither magic nor science, but also both of those things, and the means through which wild sailors achieve incredible feats and encounter unexplainable phenomena. It would be wrong to call it a magic system, it would even be wrong to call it magatech, as the phenomena of archanautics very much span the almost explicitly arcane and mystical to like impressive feats of engineering and genetics. Archanautics deals with the unexplained, but the people who deal with their particular areas of expertise seem to be able to explain them pretty well. Otherwise, they couldn't tape a gearbox and a plank together to create an improvised handheld helicopter lift system that's gonna give out after 3 uses. Or stuff a blowfish with rotten apples to create a poison dart grenade. That's much of what you do in this game. You find all manner of extremely weird resources with evocative names and come up with creative ways to utilize and combine them. And there's a lot of unusual resources out there given the sheer amount of unexplainable stuff on the waves. There's ghosts, semi-sentient automata, flying manta rays pulling floating islands, and even like living thoughts that nest in people's heads and can change reality when spoken aloud. Those are actually pretty common. Characters work with these whispers, as they're called, all the time, even if they only use them to get, as trade goods. But while people have many theories, it's not explained anywhere how these things actually work. This is the approach that the Wildsea takes with its world building. Many things, especially the deeper mysteries, are kept intentionally vague for 2 reasons. First, the game really wants tables to be able to make up their own lore, and not already know about all the mysteries of the world as their characters discover them. And also, the game wants you to be able to adjust the lore to your own preferences. So if you want a low-tech or high-tech world instead of an eclectic and vaguely defined mix of the two, you can do that. If you want a gritty world without magic, you can do that just as much as a more wondrous world with more explicit high fantasy elements. Many sections of the book offer options for lore that you can pick, or, alternate interpretations of lore it establishes, to give players and game masters the type of freedom that the system offers mechanically. Also, it refers to the game master as the Firefly. I'm personally... I'm kind of famous for not being a big fan of every game coming up with its own term for something that should be pretty universal. So I'm not gonna call it the Firefly, I'm not sticking to that nomenclature. But I doubt they'll mind. They seem to love keeping things open to interpretation. 60 pages of the core rulebook are dedicated to places that may or may not exist, because this is ultimately a game about discovering your own story to the extent that making a discovery is a game mechanic that allows players to use in-game resources to make up lore. The system, by the way, is quite good. It is originally the reason why the game was recommended to me. You may be surprised to hear this, but I am a teensy little bit of a game design nerd. And I got to thinking, I'm just gonna read this so I can understand the rules. But then the setting really ended up catching my attention. I'm gonna tell you quite a lot about it, but you should bear in mind that this is not a precisely defined setting with a map, for instance, that you can peruse somewhere that tells you definitely that this is the way things are and this is the way things are not. And this is even though mapping is a core gameplay mechanic. Much more than it is your World of Darkness, it is your Wildsea. And while I will try to stick to the original presentation where I can, much of this is also my interpretation of the setting. All of the creatures that I mentioned before, for instance, I made them all up. It's pretty easy to do once you understand the vibe the setting is going for. Or, the vibe that you're going for. I will, in many places, offer up some alternative ways of looking at things. So don't fret when something doesn't vibe with what you would prefer the setting to be. You can always just change it. Something else this game wants you to make is your own ship. And you might ask yourself, what is this sailing on the canopy nonsense? How does that even work? And the answer is actually many different ways. The foliage of the upper layers tends to be strong enough to support a ship in motion if it's not particularly heavy. The iconic Wildsea ship plows through the forest on a so-called saw prow, which you can imagine as a sort of chainsaw that grips the branches of the upper canopy and sort of pulls the ship forward through it. The branches are of course ripped apart by this, how could they not be? But that's alright, because thanks to the power of Krezerin, they will have just grown back in a few hours. The unevenness of the branchwork is of course always a risk factor. It isn't as simple as these just being the uppermost sticks of the iron roots. Most of these are parasitic trees that are sort of close to the size of trees of our world. We'd recognize them. And you know yourself just how diverse trees can be in terms of their structure, the type of foliage they carry, the texture of the branches, all the things. Some patches are particularly dense and tangled, difficult to cut through. Others don't support nearly the weight you might assume. And even others are uneven and will tilt your ship every which way. Then you have others that hide things, from rocks to constricting vines to semi-domesticated woodpeckers just waiting to drill open your hull so pirates can board your ship from below. Experienced wild sailors know what signs to look out for to cut a good path, but there's only so much experience can do about the unpredictable nature of the waves. Unless you're a particularly light vessel with little sewing power, it tends to be much more reliable to cut through the somewhat lower, thicker branches, and many civilized areas build canals through the wilderness to aid that process. But that requires just constant maintenance to fight the unceasing growth. There's a particular type of saw-prow ship called a mulcher, which is used for this type of operation. It eats the branches it cuts and fires an internal oven with it, creating these like big billowing stacks of smoke. But mulchers are rare because they're pretty big, technologically complex, and looked down upon like unfavorably by many because they use fire to get their energy. And on the Wildsea, universally, fire is a huge taboo. I mean, just imagine a wildfire in a Krezerin-fueled megaforest. There are no stopgaps, no tree lines, no end of the forest. It never runs out of material to burn. Everything it consumes just grows back, unless there's a massive rainstorm, which luckily do happen. Fires spread forever. There's a great big fire that's been raging in the north for over 100 years, and there are stories of flame tides that gained sentience and now seek to ambush entire fleets by lying in wait in treetop embers so as to not produce too much smoke. Of course, fire is immensely valuable, and heat is an essential part of using energy. But the only places you will actually find fire are on solid ground and in tightly engineered settings like mulches. Alternate ways of energy generation to power your saw-prow exist, and thanks to the strange and mutated ways of Krezerin and Archanautics, there is no shortage of them. Chemical reactions are the most common, but there's also batteries charged with lightning, spring coils that must be laboriously rewound, and plant cells that turn sunlight into liquid fuel. There's much weirder shit too, like acid reactors fueled with metal, rats, just rats, you have a bunch of rat wheels and it's rats that give you power. Or maybe the still beating heart of a dead Leviathan beast is more your speed. Although, is the Leviathan really dead? Can you be sure? Is there maybe a giant monster down there looking for its heart, which you have? All these engines can also power a variety of different modes of locomotion beyond just the saw-prow. Articulated tentacles might search for strong branches to push and pull on, or maybe you have something that makes you buoyant, and then like propellers just sort of crash you through the upper branches. Maybe your entire hull is made up of gripping chain tracks like a tank. Perhaps there's giant millipedes that pull your ship like a chariot, or maybe you actually do use sails because, after all, the winds are strong. There are countless options to make your ship truly your ship, and you're gonna spend a lot of time on it, so it's kind of a character that all players share. Adventure on the Wildsea is fundamentally about journeys and the strange encounters that they provide. And as you might have gathered, there are some strange encounters out on the green tides indeed. The people of the Wildsea don't just think of the world's geography as a collection of horizontal features, the way we mostly do. They very actively have to think about the vertical dimension, as all layers of the Wildsea are in constant reciprocal processes of cause and effect. They divide the world into 6 strata, layers if you will. And they know that this is a model to make sense of the world, not like a perfect natural law, but it's a good model. It holds up most of the time. The Wildsea's sea level is far from uniform the way you'd expect our ocean to be, for instance. I mean, you have seen the top of forests. Imagine that, but even more chaotic on account of mutations and the potential variance of what's going on underneath. These 6 layers are not remotely similar in thickness and vary from place to place, but they do create a reliable pattern. And in a world as unpredictable as the Wildsea, that's worth a lot. The skies, the upper heavens, the memory of the ocean above. Which, as a short tangent, Wildsea folk know that the pre-verdant world was covered in oceans of salty water, an ocean that is as alien to them as the Wildsea is to us. There's a phenomenon that manifests sometimes where memories of the distant past will descend upon a ship, giving the crew the impression of briny sea air and the taste of salt on their lips. But it's rare enough that most people don't even understand what it is supposed to remind them of. You might think that the obvious choice for a civilization stuck above the vast and dangerous forest would be to just use airships to get from place to place. But the skies above the Wildsea are racked by strong winds and horrid storms. You have to imagine that this is a high-altitude world with very few wind-breaking features, making strong wind conditions even strong windier. It's only the highest of peaks, the tallest of tall shank trees, and a few floating islands up there maybe, and especially the latter tend to be up there for good reason. Additionally, the canopy of the Wildsea, which generates the little friction the air does get at ground level, is extremely uneven, creating an enormous amount of turbulence, which makes takeoff and landing especially dangerous. Then you have the swarms of insects, birds of prey, sentient storms, and various sort of gigantic sky creatures roiling above. So even when you are lucky enough to get up there on a calm day, there's 100 other things to worry about. And on a calm night, it's the stars that watch you. Imagine there's a huge crowd over there, and you're standing here. You'd expect that every once in a while someone among them will look at you. But there's so many people, you can never really tell. They all become this anonymous mass. It doesn't matter if any one of them is looking at you. But if one of them stands apart from the crowd, closer to you, even if they're still far away, you'll notice when they're looking at you. That's how the stars feel when you go up there into the sky. That's why they're keeping their gaze on you. That's the key issue in the skies, the issue from which all others derive. You see everything, but everything can see you as well. For pirates sailing down on the lignin tide, you are a prime target. Others could turn a corner and sink into invisibility, but you're up there, a fixed point upon which to converge. They will be lapping at your heels like pinwolves, and some of them, you'll find, don't even need to shoot you down with cannons. They have wings of their own. None of this stops intrepid explorers and tinkerers from trying to conquer the skies. After all, the flying islands continue to be up there for good reason. There's people in the sky too, civilization, not just fellow aeronaut adventurers and aerial leviathan hunters. If you go up high enough, where the air gets frigid and eventually so thin you can barely breathe, you will find isolated cities, suspended from the heavens themselves. And the people of those cities will be stranger than any you could encounter on the Wildsea. And strange people means strange deals and valuable goods to trade with the surface. Just remember not to look at the stars for too long. The thrash, the top part, if you will, the actual uppermost layer of the canopy, where the ships sail and where most of the game happens. Unless you're playing a very particular kind of campaign, that is. Unlike the open ocean, which is mostly a desert, the thrash teems with life everywhere. Humans may not be well suited to living among the branches, but plenty of other life forms are. There's also reefs of scrap from destroyed ships and settlements, and skeletons, spits of land suspended above the branches, sometimes traveling as they slip and slip. Bloom tides of flowers like the foam cresting waves, carrying ships fast, but not at all reliably. No two patches of the Wildsea are exactly the same, even from day to day. It's not just the constant growth pushing ever-evolving ecologies around, it's the iron roots themselves that move and rearrange their roots and trunks as they search for new sources of nutrients deep down below. Anything swimming on the iron roots could crash down into the depths on any day, which doesn't stop people from living in these structures called spits and exploiting their resources. You have to live somewhere, after all. Conversely, ancient wrecks, structures, and monstrosities could be unearthed from the deep tomorrow, or worse, yesterday. Sometimes rifts open up that lead straight to the deepest parts of the Wildsea, shifting and beckoning with malevolent intelligence, exerting the call of the deep on all who travel near them. Only things that stand firmly on the ground below have any sort of permanence. But that's mostly mountains and tall shank trees, which, like iron roots, are a type of mutation that makes these individual trees poke up far above the canopy. Perhaps the occasional freakishly gigantic building, the foundations of which were not ripped to shreds by iron roots, still pokes out there. But that is excessively rare and sort of necessitates that the world you are playing in was at some point able to construct buildings kilometers tall. Not all chaos, of course. There are vast regions defined by biomes and unshakable boundaries where you are more likely to encounter certain types of trees, certain types of wildlife, certain types of weather conditions. The waves are the wind blowing through the trees, but they're also the canopy being just very uneven. So unlike the open ocean, you can hide behind a wave or just descend underwater real quick, no matter what kind of ship you're on. You also never know what's behind a given wave in turn. The cartographers of the Wildsea are in a constant race to update charts and find permanent identifiable features by which to help sailors orient themselves. Almost every port, no matter how small, has a kartoika office, where crews exchange their maps and charts with more current local ones, updating the kartoika as the kartoika updates them. This is not some sort of world-spanning institution, but a type of place where everyone collaborates because it's necessary for the safe navigation of the Wildsea. As for politics, each area will have its factions, but with settlements being these concentrated dots separated by vast and dangerous green, we effectively live in a world of city-states. And these city-states are isolated and filled with local weirdness enough to have very distinct cultures and identities. It is in many ways an accepting world. Every city is a port city, and they all rely on trade. So the thing that happens, that has happened in pretty much every port city throughout history, is that when people see something weird, they just sort of shrug. They don't need to understand everything to know it probably doesn't mean them harm. And sometimes things that seem entirely innocuous are lethal, so you can't really rely on your prejudices. But it's not just trade from port to port you can make a fortune from in the Thrash. If you set sail out there and just keep your eyes peeled, chances are you'll find something valuable. The constant shifts and mutations will present you with new species packed with alchemical and culinary qualities, as well as ancient wrecks and reefs to be plundered all the time. And while leviathans are rare and dangerous, slaying one will make you rich. The Tangle, just below the surface, is considered by many to sort of still be part of the Thrash, and it is indeed sometimes not clear where it begins. Yes, you can say below the canopy, that is technically the definition, but it's not water that has a distinct surface. Instead, you're dealing with sort of a coastline problem where the more accurate you're trying to be, the more surface you will get. The Tangle is a little darker, a little more sheltered from the wind, but you know, not by much. It's probably where most of the wildlife resides, and in practice tends to be where ships come to rest when they are not in motion. Usually they're constructed in a way that at least the upper decks are still exposed to the open sky, but the hull almost needs to be supported by the much thicker branches down here. It's a place where the analogy of the open sea breaks down a little bit and creates a very interesting new space to play in. Because when you go overboard on a ship, you're in the water, and humans are not made for the water. We have to swim down there. We can't breathe underneath the water. That's not really a problem in the Tangle. With how dense it all is, you'll almost definitely be caught by a branch of some sort, instead of falling down into the depths. And you can climb around that space without much issue, provided you know how to climb. Well, you know, aside from the flora and fauna that might kill you as well. Many ships prefer to go low anyway, either because they're heavy or because they're trying to stay hidden. And many settlements include parts that are in the Tangle more than anywhere else. So it's yet another way in which the surface of the Wildsea is more of an idea than a dividing line. In fact, most of the really valuable stuff is going to be down there, hidden just below the tides, not yet picked clean by earlier bird opportunists. But it's more dangerous too, not just because you're a little closer to the deadly depths. There's pinwolf packs and carnivorous plants, air heavily laden with spores, giant insect swarms going round and round the trunk until they've eaten it away like beavers, mossy spiders weaving nets of vines strong enough to catch ships, and much weirder things too. Because this area gets a lot of sunlight still, you're liable to find the most pre-verdant type tree species here. You know, those parasites hooked into the much larger iron roots, but sometimes also anchored on perhaps an errant piece of soil, which is quite valuable. Oh, so it seems, until that bright yellow ginkgo's roots turn out to be tentacles, and it runs away from you, screaming into the dark. The sink, the dense empty, the place where darkness rises from the deep. It's the area where, like, the deep Wildsea truly begins. But it's in many ways not too different from the Tangle. It's a dense landscape of roots, leaves, and branches, and yes, there's fewer leaves and the branches tend to be thicker, but the main difference, the crucial difference, is it's like darker down there. There may be a diffuse glow from above in the sink if the tangle above is thin or you're really not that far down, but you will almost never encounter actual daylight here. And when you do, it's often cause for concern. Instead, patches of bioluminescence act as beacons in the dark. Many things down here glow, from vast mushroom colonies to sticky vines, swarms of torchbugs, and the specters of dead wild sailors who didn't realize that other things don't glow down here because they don't want to be seen. It's also much quieter as well. Not actually quiet by any stretch of the imagination, but life is much more reserved. Where sight becomes unreliable, sound is a valuable resource not to be wasted. In theory, almost any Wildsea ship can just go down there, so long as it's got the bite to dig a little bit. Not that a sailing ship would be completely lost, there are still gusts of wind down there, but they don't come from the surface and usually carry spores that'll make you lose your mind, or the hot stink of a leviathan's breath maybe. Point remains, if you can angle your ship downward, eventually you'll end up here. But usually the sorts of ships that actually make the journey are submersibles, equipped with strong saws and grappling hooks, as well as sealed decks to make sure the Wildsea doesn't invade. Crews are trained and equipped to deal with the lack of visibility. You can't go up on a crow's nest to watch for danger or pick a safe path. You might have to get out and cut away vegetation where the engines are struggling. You also have to do that on the surface sometimes, to be fair, but there, like, the vegetation is only below the ship for the most part, and not nearly as thick. Like in the deep sea, there is pressure down here, not just air pressure, which is not entirely negligible either, especially since it comes laden with spores and creserin fumes, but the main pressure is psychological. The sink wants to get into your hull, into your mind, infect your thoughts with terror and despair. It doesn't want to see you dead necessarily, though dead is almost certainly how you'll end up if you believe that. There's a plenitude of rare resources in the sink. Pre-verdant ruins and locations more stable than farther up. Wrecks no one has laid eyes upon for centuries. There are low ports hidden away in old mine shafts and tree trunks, or heavily fortified submerged vessels, inhabited by people who may never see the light of day their entire lifetime. And of course, the upper nests and migration routes of gargantuan leviathans. They're actually quite common down here. And even though they have even more of a home field advantage in addition to their enormity and powers, some choose to hunt them here nonetheless. But I've said this word a lot, Leviathan. What even is it? Well, a Leviathan is a unique creature of gargantuan proportions that exists because it was mutated into the state by creserin, which down here is of course particularly abundant. A Leviathan could be anything, and perhaps the most iconic category of Leviathan is squirrels the size of city blocks. But there's much more. You could be dealing with an iron-plated centipede, broad as a highway, that moves with incredible speed. Something vaguely resembling a bear climbing from the deep, dark fur sporting a vast fungal colony, and it can rend the flesh from your bones with a mighty roar. A being that entirely defies recognition. 8 limbs, a gelatinous body with indigo scales, frills around a mouthless head that capture and digest the memories of the living and the souls of the dead. Perhaps something even stranger than that, like a clockwork automaton or a laser crab traveling backwards through time. Anything can exist in the Wildsea, and anything scaled up to gigantic proportions can be a leviathan. The definition is a social convention, and it's sort of defined by the idea that these beings are unique first and foremost. Non-unique creatures of that size are called proto-leviathans, which makes them sound a little less scary perhaps, but shouldn't allay your fears one bit, because they can be just as nasty. And honestly, with how little people ultimately know about each Leviathan, who knows if the one we call Big Husker is really the only one of its kind. Maybe it's the only one of a species that travels far up into the canopy. Maybe the others just hang out down below. Or maybe it's a whole species that we just think is a single individual because we can't tell them apart. It's a mystery. The Drown is where things really change. It is in many ways the true deep, the place upon which the Wildsea rests. It's actually rather quiet down here, and not too warm nor too cold. Isolated from the elements above by layers upon layers of forest, and warmed by the decay of detritus. Even at the height of winter, when all the leaves above are gone, no light reaches the Drown. It's not a region even Wildsea submariners visit all that often. Known to some as the sky below, it actually opens up. There are vast chasms and stretches without branches. This is where the trunks of the iron roots are at their thickest, and there is no use at all for foliage. And if you sail on a ship that relies on sawing through tangled branches to move forward, navigating an area like this is going to be difficult. Now, there are of course vessels that use sort of grappling hooks and the like, actuated arms, perhaps even some sort of lift system to save you from a sudden crash into nothingness. But really, why would you be here at all? There's not actually that much going on, both in terms of trade and resources to be found. Most of the real valuables are nestled in the branches above, and when something is lifted by the mighty iron roots from below, it only passes through here. The air is heavy with Crezerin. It practically oozes out of every trunk. The predators here are patient and quiet. You will never hear them coming until you are already eaten. Except of course the ones who built Trap, where you will see your doom coming. Don't rely on your crewmates to cut you loose when you get pulled in by a vine trap, because the vampire mole who made it is just around the corner, and its star nose has teeth. All this space is where Leviathans grow so large. The sink may be their backyard, but the Drown is their living room. There is, of course, a certain mysticism to the Drown. It feels almost like a sacred place, the only place on the Wildsea where you will ever hear the sound of nothing. But there's not much here you can't get elsewhere, so I suspect the reason you travel down this far is to go to a place I very much recommend you stay away from. Though since you have made it this far, I don't think you're the type to be dissuaded by common sense, because you, my friend, are headed for the darkness under eaves, also often referred to simply as the under eaves. And I wish I could tell you literally anything about this place, but I can't. And that's sort of by design. The Wildsea takes great care to paint a very particular tone, while at the same time never locking you into a particular lore. Nothing in Wildsea lore is set in stone. You are always explicitly encouraged to make up your own stuff if you prefer. And for the darkness under eaves, the ground level, the place where the old world used to be, it takes this so far that it offers nothing in the way of perhaps not canon, but certainly a main lore interpretation of the place. Quite frankly, the game is not about the darkness under eaves. It's there, of course, much like the deep sea in any fantasy campaign or the core of the earth, but it's not a place you're actually supposed to go to unless you're playing a very particular kind of campaign. That doesn't mean there's nothing at all about it in the books. They don't just leave this spot completely blank. They understand that there is the lure of mystery down there. Every inhabitant of the Wildsea wonders from time to time what goes on in the darkness under eaves. The solution is to offer various possible scenarios, and making very explicit that you can put down there whatever you want, and frankly, it doesn't even need to be interesting. There might be nothing left down there but the roots and pulverized ruins of the old world in pools of pure Crezerin. But it's all dead. Nothing actually lives down there, not even leviathans. Or it could be that there's an entire civilization. A civilization of detritus feeders, perhaps. Maybe Ketra, maybe Gal, maybe something else altogether. Maybe it's a vast mechanical landscape that produces all the Crezerin that mutates the overworld. Maybe it's just a vast fungal ecosystem. Maybe it's a graveyard of forgotten souls, a sort of purgatory, or maybe a cold hell, or a hot hell. Maybe you can go so deep you fall out of the sky. Or maybe it's just as teeming with life as the rest of the Wildsea. Just different life. It could be lucrative to go down there, but there has to be some sort of reason why no one has ever met anyone who believably claimed that they visited the darkness under eaves. Then again, perhaps the sole reason people don't believe them is that the stories they tell are so unbelievable. Perhaps the stories just never match up. Perhaps the Undereaves are just as varied as the Wildsea above. But then again, it may also just be impossible to reach them because they don't exist at all. Maybe the trunks of the iron roots never end. Maybe there are no roots. It's trees all the way down. I can't tell you. You will have to find that out for yourself. The only thing that you need to remember is that a trip to these depths is not something undertaken lightly. It's a whole campaign arc, and one that puts the crew at serious risk of death, or things much, much worse than death. Now, like a minute ago, you may have heard me say the terms like Ketra and Gao, and you may be wondering what that means. A huge variety of different sapient species called bloodlines inhabit the Wildsea, and many of them originate in pre-verdant times. But they're not all equally common, so the game categorizes them as the core 4, who make up the majority of the population, and the rising 3, who are also significant in number. But even those are not the only ones described in the rulebooks, and not the only ones to have been explicitly developed as player character options to pick. There's a bunch of other much rarer bloodlines out there that are usually found only in a particular reach, which I like to call the miscellaneous many, and we'll talk about those a little bit as well. The Ardent are, simply put, humans. But not quite. They too have been changed by life on the Wildsea, which has made them much more athletic and rugged on average. Blessed with great strength and endurance, as well as a powerful immune system that is much better at handling toxins and diseases. They are the most numerous of the core 4, though just how much more numerous than the others is entirely up to you. And so they have a vast array of cultures that they sort of integrate with other bloodlines. A recurring theme in Ardent cultures, though, is their deep connection to spirituality and the stories and memories of their ancestors. Ardent frequently make offerings to guardian specters and commune with their progenitors, often in the very literal sense that they talk to ghosts that are just there. They seek their counsel, they are judged by them. Being able to trace your descent to a particular pre-verdant family line can bring much honor and respect. Which isn't to say that individual merit and achievement count any less. In a place as unforgiving as the Wildsea, nobody can coast on heritage alone. And after all, don't you want to make your ancestors proud? Some alternative presentations of Ardent could be to lean either into or farther away from the core humanity aspect, which goes from they are genetically the same as regular humans, which is, I mean, what really is the point of that? To, like, their adaptations and mutations potentially include aspects of human-adjacent animals, whether that be monkey fur, feline claws, a dog's fine nose. Personally, I am a big fan of permitting a much broader range of color, so green skin, blue hair, red eyes, that kind of stuff. I think the ardent are perfect for, without requiring much in the way of an explanation. The Ectus are cactus people. They say they come from an ancient place called the Eaten Desert, and as they grow so ancient that some of their elders are still around from pre-verdant times, people are inclined to believe them. They also grow tall and lanky, though not brittle, and make for warriors with significant reach. The fact that many of them are covered in countless painful spines only adds to their reputation as fierce combatants. Most of them don't have eyes, which, yes, does imply that some of them do, but the average Ectus makes sense of the world with extremely sensitive heat vision, combined with an acute sense of smell and vibrations. Not excellent at long distances for sure, but very sharp when it comes to their immediate surroundings. There's a wide variety of Ectus, and they like modifying their bodies with useful parts from other Ectus, or organs essentially grown on the vine, if you will. Of the core four, the actors are perhaps the most isolationist, as the vast majority of them lives in a region called the Icterin, functionally a desert on the Wildsea, a sun-blasted reach of sand dunes and giant cacti. It's maybe the strongest echo of pre-verdant civilization, and even with the countless Ectus that travel far and wide tend to be drawn back to it again and again. Even Ectus born far away from the Icterin sometimes dream of it. Alternate ideas for the Ectus include extending their options to other plants that aren't cacti at all, be that just natural or because of their propensity for genetic engineering, or perhaps even going so far as to including actual wood, not just flowering plants in their bodies. They don't need to originate in the Eaten Desert at all. The cactus aspect can be limited to just a particular type of larger species of plant people. The ghoul, a species of microorganisms, not microorganisms. They existed in pre-verdant times, but they were not numerous and probably stuck to the fringes of society. But the Wildsea, especially the layers just below the canopy, offered an incredible amount of space for the evolutionary niche they occupied. It's a world of darkness and decay, filled with life to be consumed and propagated. Contrary to intuition, ghoul are not colony organisms, but discrete individuals composed of fungal tissue. And when I say a discrete individual, I mean a discrete individual. Ghoul are unspeakably diverse and able to incorporate all manner of spores into their body, which become part of a system that helps them deliberately and subconsciously adapt to the specific circumstances of their individual lives. Some ghoul may look similar, but no two ghoul look the same. They are born in gigantic fungal hives called mycosanctums, which are exposed to all the same dangers every other settlement in the Wildsea is exposed to. They're just also not a particularly nice place to spend time in if you're not ghoul. You might assume that ghoul have fewer problems with life in the Wildsea than other bloodlines, and might thus be primarily associated with the dark, damp, and dangerous places, and this is perhaps true to an extent, but hostile spores and Creserins still wreak havoc on them just like anyone else. Predators like eating them, and they don't know what's going on deep under their mycosanctums either. They are, frankly, just as terrified as everybody else. And if you want to expand the definition of ghoul, you can do so by making it possible for them to, be made from other organisms without a strongly defined body plan, like moss or coral, that would work, making them a bit more distributed and hive-minded, or perhaps allowing them to be made of variable non-living matter, such as ice or stone. Then, of course, you really need to put in the work to see how it changes the species, and one of the other bloodline options might just be better suited for what you're trying to do. The Zellicrae are, trigger warning if you hate creepy crawlies and specifically spiders, but that's what they are. They are swarms of spiders in humanoid configurations. The individual spiders they are composed of are not particularly intelligent, though they are cleverer than the spiders of our world. Only together do they create a swarm intelligence that effectively constitutes one individual. Though the subjective cognitive experience of individual Zellicrae tend to be such that most of them refer to themselves as us instead of I. Scholars are pretty sure that Zellicrae did not exist before the Wildsea, and their origins are not well understood. It seems like sometimes batches of spider eggs hatch simultaneously, and all begin acting in unison, growing over time as they develop a collective sapience. Many Zellicrae have taken to cultivating further individuals of their species through esoteric and often bizarre means. A unifying force among them tends to be their desire to be civilized people, though who knows if maybe there aren't Zellicrae out there attempting to be animals. To this end, they mimic what they see and try to appear as humanoid as possible, seeking not only to dress like people in terms of clothes, but in terms of skin. They have a thing called the lottery of skin, where the outer shells of various bloodlines are removed, patched back together, and given to Zellicrae to wear. All above board, of course, people sell their skin after they die, and most Zellicrae find other materials to manufacture some sort of skin. Most bloodlines find their mimicry extremely unnerving as it is, and even now many are not too fond of spiders, so Zellicrae understand that they need to be on their best behavior when it comes to acquiring skins. Which doesn't stop some of the more desperate or nefarious elements from just taking a skin they like. Alternate interpretations of Zellicrae are, of course, the obvious, using other swarming organisms. Whatever your phobia is, we got the skin suit crawling with them pretending to be human for you. Ants, horn beetles, moths, crabs, worms, you name it, we got it all. These can even turn out pretty cute, like, when they're made of bees or rats. Or if you want to go out, I say fuck it. Take any organism, miniaturize it, make it a swarm, whether it is a swarm or not. There's no reason Zellicrae shouldn't be made of tiny kittens, or starfish, or crows. Moving on to the Rising 3, the Ironbound are what happens when you ascribe objects enough of a personality for an extended period of time. They grow souls. This happens most commonly with ships, and usually they awaken after the trauma of being destroyed or abandoned to some extent, either inhabiting reassembled parts of the original construct or just manifesting incorporeally and rapidly adopting just the planks and steel and cogs and ropes that are lying around. It follows that Ironbound are immensely diverse in their composition and abilities. Many do grow attached to their particular parts, others discard them on a constant quest to improve or just change themselves. They pop into existence fully formed, but they have no life experience, which often leads them to making odd, perhaps naive decisions. But they learn quickly, and it wouldn't be clever at all to assume that just because you are faced with an Ironbound, they're going to have the mind of a child. Most of them don't. The emergence of an Ironbound can be scary, but they rarely face the same prejudices that, for instance, Zellicrae face because they're products of civilized creation, right? Even if that creation is effectively wreckage and trash. Often they're explicitly the manifestation of something inanimate so valued that people treated it like a person. Of course, the fact that they tend to manifest in isolation often makes it so the people who did once treat that object like a person are no longer around. Instead of limiting yourself to shipwreck automata, you could lean into the concept of sort of genius loci type Ironbound. Perhaps they are an animated construction gantry or a suit of armor, if you want to hit some fantasy tropes. Hell, maybe they're actually magical servitors created by wizards, animated prow figureheads or golems. The important element is that their soul is real. But of course, that also often ends up depending on whether you have any souls in your setting that are real. The Ketra are very much children of the Wildsea, and in spite of their extremely weird appearance, they're actually close cousins to the Ardent, at least in terms of ancestry. Yeah, this is what Krezerin does. This is what it does to you. They descend from those remnants of humanity that managed to find refuge from the Wildsea below the canopy, in more or less sealed places like bunkers and mineshafts, where they enjoyed some measure of protection from the many hazards of the darkness below. Huge numbers of people crowded into warrens rarely equipped to support any level of population long term, their society adapted to be brutally pragmatic and always ready to make difficult choices. Their most remarkable feature is their gelatinous body, which allows them to squeeze through very tight spaces in a way like an octopus might, and which additionally allows them to replace their their bones with other, often sturdier materials, or materials with greater utility to their particular chosen role. They also have these sensory tentacles that help them perceive in the often total darkness of their home, and a certain degree of resistance against Treetop. They only emerged onto the surface rather recently, and didn't always receive a warm welcome, but the crammed confines and the depths just never really worked out in terms of living conditions, and they need new places to lead better lives. Something that fascinates me is that all these isolated populations of humans mutated into sort of the same species, which is not how evolution works at all, but which does suggest that Krezerin has some sort of homogenization of information transfer ability. Alternate views on the Ketra might take a more of a terror from the deep approach and make them unrelated to humans. Maybe they're sapient jellyfish or octopuses, or, the book suggests, maybe make them some measure of undead? The Mothrin are, well, moths. They're moth people. Highly energetic and creative, beloved for their squeaky voices and positive outlook all over the Wildsea. Though their bodies are lithe and spry, Mothrin wings are not strong enough for flight, though gliding can often make all the difference out on the dizzying heights. So, they're far from useless. Most Mothrin treat their wings as sort of vestigial organs that can be utilized purely as an element of fashion and aesthetic, which is something that Mothrin are all about. They have a strong artistic streak and love to get passionate about this or that craft or project or topic. Their outgoing nature makes them excellent teachers as well, though unfortunately few make it to an age where they can actually teach, because Mothrin lives are cursed or blessed with a peculiar form of short-lived immortality. They sense when the end of their natural life is imminent after 20-odd years, and can repupate, wrapping themselves in a cocoon and liquefying as caterpillars do, then reforming into a whole new individual. Memories of past lives are scattered and sporadic, like something out of a dream you remember forgetting. They're a fully formed but different person, and though they often keep their names, that's more a courtesy to other bloodlines, maybe a show of respect to their ancestors. An interesting aspect of their history is that they claim to have existed pre-Verdancy, but no one else remembers them. There are no records in the few records that exist. They claim their society was under something called the rationing of color, a deeply conservative and isolationist tradition of government that eschewed all contact with other sapient life. They might say they've come a long way since then. A few alternate interpretations of the Mothrin, of course, include insects that are not moths, such as the obvious butterflies and other insects, perhaps even other flying creatures like bats and birds. For this, the difficulty lies in finding an alternative to repupation, because very few of these actually, pupate. But hey, maybe they just do anyway. Maybe the birds build an egg around themselves, or maybe the bats just hibernate and their body changes during that time. If they're sentient thunderstorms, there can be this. And finally, we come to the miscellaneous many, of which there are 3 described in the official books, but of which, of course, there exist countless ones. I'm only going to touch on each of them briefly, as they should be very much reserved for niche plays by experienced players. First, we have the Karchabara, who hail from the remote and frankly weird reach of Duzak's Vent, whose stony Volkrez trees run on lava instead of resin. The Karchabara are descended from sharks, obviously, and while their minds are perfectly sapient, they still very much struggle with their old predatory instincts. As a people, they feel incredibly young and inexperienced in the ways of the world, while also carrying within themselves an ancestral memory of being unspeakably ancient. The Karchabara are apex predators. They have tough skin, shark noses, and a Wildsea-adapted swim bladder that helps them land on their feet like cats. They are, of course, not evil by any stretch of the imagination. They just have this struggle of a newfound ability to love and empathize, be part of a community, juxtaposed with old instincts that often still serve them well. If you wanted a somewhat different take on that, you could definitely expand them to not just be like sharks, but all kinds of sea creatures, like squids, or anglerfish. The Koron are androids from the reach of Prophet's Fall, actual high-tech machines which, unlike Ironbound, do not manifest spontaneously but were purpose-built. If only they could remember their purpose. In the society of Prophet's Fall, they are considered sacred because they're attuned to the chatter of the universe, aka radio waves and the like, and feature as central figures in the local religion. They are considered to have souls just like everybody else, perhaps even more exaltedly so, and are afforded great respect. Due to the particular high-tech nature of Prophet's Fall, the book leaves it very open whether or not they exist in your world. The Dawewe are inhabitants of the Ambered Ions. Like the Ketra, they are cousins of the Ardent, descended of old humanity, but particularly tall and emaciated. Tribal hunters native to areas beneath the canopy. Their greyish-white skin doesn't do well in direct sunlight. In darkness, it's covered in complex patterns of bioluminescence, which they use to communicate. Most Dawewe choose to be mute, as sound can get you killed deep in the drown. They're also all born with a twin that they share an almost telepathic connection with, which they believe happens because their heartbeats become synchronized through ritualistic hunting practices. The Itsenko are mantis people from the depths of a region known as Wildsea. They emerged spontaneously due to Krezeran mutation and have recently been showing up here and there across the Wildsea. They share many thematic similarities with the Gao and the Mothran. They're capable of a sort of self-directed adaptation through molting, which allows them to shed and regenerate their exoskeleton every few weeks. And their life goal tends to be to find the perfect form, at which point they deliberately calcify and become a statue. That's the end of their life. They are not just adaptable, but also industrious, wanting to get things done and refusing to sit around. Something noteworthy about all the bloodlines is that they are very mutable from person to person. For some of them, finding people who look even similar can be quite uncommon. It's not like them in most RPG systems where being a dwarf gives you +2 to strength and +1 to constitution and resistance to poison. The Wildsea presents these traits as options. You could have any of them, they are common among dwarves, but not all dwarves are like that. I quite like this approach, though I don't hate the traditional approach. I think it's more suited to certain types of games than others. But there's also a Watsonian reason why this is the case. All of these species are exposed to Krezeran. They live in a world where mutation happens all the time, so you would expect that the individual members of these species would be very diverse from the get-go. There's just a greater range of possibilities. And I think that's very clever. It just feels right. Now, all these people do have their own cultures, but because of the cosmopolitan nature of the Wildsea, very few places are going to be inhabited only by 1 or 2 bloodlines. In fact, the concept of cosmopolitanism is rooted in most of these cultures themselves, right? Certain communities might be isolationist, never the culture at large. The truth is that especially wild sailors tend to be a pretty diverse bunch, not just in bloodline. Every single settlement has a particular culture of its own, shaped by the specific challenges it needs to deal with, as well as just the random ebbs and flows of human creativity. But many of these challenges tend to be similar for people living under similar circumstances, even if they're not neighbors. So there are strong cultural parallelisms and mutual identification with certain labels, even among distant peoples. I'm about to get into some of those grand cultures, which as character elements are known as origins. However, though these cultures comprise the majority of the origins, there are some origins as gameplay elements that are not so much cultural, but more about individual fates that have shaped people. And I'm going to explain them separately. This is a lore overview video, not a player's handbook. Do be reminded that if you like a particular cultural background and one of those individual fates, you don't have to pick either or. You can mix them. The system allows for that. We begin at the top, with the Cosma, the people of the sky. They live up there in floating satellite cities, some of which travel through the perpetual darkness of the heavens at unspeakable speed. Cosma are strange, and many people don't even believe in their existence. Those who do sometimes think of them either as magical angel-type beings that fell from the heavens, or alien interlopers, and even those people are unlikely to ever have met a Cosma. It's not that easy to travel down from the skies, or at least not that easy to do so safely. But if you ever do meet a Cosma, you'll probably know, because they are strange folks indeed. Aside from the altitude, the constant problem they all have to deal with is the scrutiny of the stars above them. They don't want to be noticed, so it's common for them to cover their faces whenever they're out under an open sky. And these masks have sort of become a key fashion item among Cosma, a way to express their identity while keeping themselves veiled. They also don't want to be understood. So in addition to whatever off practices their isolated communities have, Cosma tend to develop their own idiosyncratic little rituals and habits that have meaning only to one individual. The stars are always watching, and you want to keep them confused. Cosma also tend to be a little more technologically advanced than most Wildsea cultures, or at least more familiar with high tech, because their satellite cities tend to be technological in nature. But that need not be the case. These places could be a bunch of naturally buoyant rocks on the back of a placid sky leviathan instead of like Bespin-style cloud towns or space stations sailing on lunar winds. They also don't all need to care about masks, right? Maybe they prefer different ways of covering their face. Or maybe they don't do it at all because they never go outdoors, which kind of does necessitate that being an option. And also means you are unlikely to ever meet anyone from that city because they don't leave. Or who knows, maybe they just stare right up there. Commune with the stars instead of avoiding them. If you prefer solid ground, maybe the Ridgeback is more your speed. There's not a lot of solid ground left on the Wildsea, and those who live on it are proud of that privilege. They feel connected to pre-verdant times and the lifestyle of all the cultures back then. They feel a connection to the earth below, even though they're just as far away as everyone else. Farther away, even in some ways. They call upon ancestor spirits and worship primordial religions of the pre-verdant past. When the Verdancy hit, everyone who could fled up to the highest peaks, and they took care to bring their most sacred and valuable belongings with them. There's a lot of religious iconography up there. Ridgeback communities are hardly easy and idyllic just because the sea doesn't constantly encroach upon them. Which, just to make this clear, the sea does encroach upon them, it's just not constant. There's a reason why those peaks and plateaus are not overgrown. They tend to be pretty damn inhospitable. But they provide some conditions of pure luxury as well, such as space, the ability to safely work with fire, access to stone, general peace of mind. Ridgebacks don't need to worry that the ground under their feet might shift at any second. As a result, Ridgebacks tend to be pretty chill, sturdy and reliable, but also adept craftsmen. Some might be a bit obsessive in their religious fanaticism, or worse, mildly uncautious out on the Wildsea. The mountains that Ridgebacks inhabit tend to bring with them many dangers of their own. I mean, you know, even in our modern world, the cultures that live up in the mountains tend to stick to the valleys, not the peaks. But Ridgebacks don't need to be of the mountains at all, depending on how you run the setting. The pre-verdant world may have had any number of unspeakably tall and, most importantly, solid structures that poke out through the canopy. Skyscrapers, statues, bridges, oil drilling rigs lodged so solidly in the landscape as to be effectively unbreakable. People who live on all of these sorts of structures could consider themselves Ridgebacks. The defining feature is that there needs to be solid ground under their feet. If that doesn't appeal to you at all, maybe you're more of a rootless, perpetual nomads that travel around particular areas in their ships, or go from horizon to horizon, never looking back. Rootless social units Cirids are fleet families, which are more than simply crews, but people bonded by mutual experience. They are very much found families. The blood we spill together is thicker than the water that runs through our veins, as the saying goes. You might say that all wild sailors are rootless, and some rootless certainly see their crews this way, but at the end of the adventure, most wild sailors return to the safety of home. To the rootless, the wild sea is already home. There's lots of different rootless lifestyles that are not dissimilar to what wild sailors think of as specialties in their profession. Some fleet families ply the trade routes or get paid to secure travel, either through engineering or by providing protection. Others live as herders, scavengers, pirates, or perhaps leviathan hunters. Some fleet families live on a single small ship. Others maintain vessels the size of towns. Some never sleep in the same spot twice. Others will seek out an area and stay there a while. Fleet families tend to form, fleets, alliances with other rootless that foster a sense of shared identity, especially if they rove similar areas and lead similar lifestyles. They don't always travel together. Usually what happens is that a few ships stick together, but they're still part of a larger fleet, and every once in a while they all meet up and it's a big party. But alternative configurations to this also happen. Most rootless travel the surface of the Wildsea. That's what most people do already, after all. But there are fleets out there who prefer the soaring heights of the skies or the crammed confines of the deep. All that depends on the reasons why they travel. The thing that defines rootless is, ironically, how they stick together, how they make their family, and that goes further than just the job. Life aboard many wave cutters requires proficient climbing skills, and no one is a more intuitive climber than a shankling. I've mentioned them before, but there are individual trees that have been mutated by Krezerin to become not iron roots, but tall shanks, and they spear through the canopy, towering landmarks visible far and wide. They're not as permanent as stone, obviously. Even the mightiest tree eventually falls, but for the sake of shanklings, they might as well be. Something they very much don't have in common with the land is that there is absolutely no solid ground here. Not a hope, not a chance. It's all just balancing, swinging, gliding. I can only mimic the balancing because there's no... maybe I do this and this looks like gliding perhaps. If you are really lucky, this particular tall shank community is partly burrowed into the trunk. Even if safety infrastructure is in place, of which there is no guarantee, it's a long way down. These tree-dwelling communities shape and live in harmony with the unique ecosystems that tall shanks develop. Because they are relatively safe, tall shanks serve as preferred nesting grounds for many birds, and in exchange for the small tithes of, maybe a few eggs, the shanklings ensure their broods stay safe. But a tall shank might host all manner of animals. There might be monkeys or sloths, insects and arachnids, hell, even really weird stuff like floating crabs. They're out there. Shanklings know that their tall shank has its distinct vibe and aesthetic, and they cultivate that shit. They really care about fashion, design, beauty. How about a Derek Guy themed character? If you see someone on the Wildsea who is a sharp or extravagant dresser, chances are they're a shankling. If they're completely unafraid of heights, that's another clue. Paradisic though it may seem, life on a tall shank is not for the faint-hearted. Shanklings, in their elegance, make it look so easy, but they have years of experience. Some shanklings are very uncomfortable when there's too much solid ground. It feels weirdly treacherous to them. Many of these people have never been anywhere other than the woven reed matting of a nest house constantly swaying in the wind. Speaking of which, tall shanks are very popular with aeronauts, as most of them will have at least a little bit of infrastructure in place to service skyfaring vessels. Much more precarious are the lives of the spitborn, dwellers of those pieces of land that just sort of lie around on the Wildsea. The definition of land is a very broad one here. Spits are perhaps the most diverse form of settlement in this setting because literally any structure you can live on floating on the tides counts as a spit. This could be half of an upturned wreck, some gigantic beast's skeleton, an overgrown little shack, a flat boulder, or an entire cathedral. The rootquakes push things up and pull them back down, all the time. And while most spits last a few months at least, probably even a few years, a spit that's older than a decade is remarkable, and it usually means there's something else going on that keeps it stable. Some disappear after like a day or two. That's very rare though. Spits in general don't usually just sort of disappear overnight in a flash, though it does happen. Most of the time there are signs that the spit is slipping, and the Spitborn have a vast arsenal of engineering solutions to stabilize its descent and get a couple more months out of it. But with each new rootquake, more and more Spitborn pack it in and book passage on one of the many ships that converge on spits in times like these. And with every person that leaves, a little bit of labor, a little bit of economic power leaves the spit as well, and condemns it further and further to the depths. Life on a spit tends to be a cramped affair, every day pushing your way past people who are not quite itinerant enough to be ruthless, but also know not to form attachment to places if they can avoid it. Some have resources, but never enough to support everyone who settles there. So gangs and criminality tend to be rampant. Especially as times move on, parts of a spit will be located deep within the tangle, where the poor can be so poor that the only thing people will notice when they get snatched up by a lion's mane is that some real estate has freed up down there. Trickle-down economics. Spitborn need to always be prepared if they want to survive. This is also true about the submerged, who are not just people who have chosen to live underneath the green waves, but whose bodies have been shaped by generations of Krezerin exposure to be adapted to life in the green hell that is the Wildsea. It would be wrong to call them primitive, perhaps not quite so wrong, though certainly prejudiced, to call them monstrous, in the sense that they rely on their natural ability to adapt to their environment more than they do technology, and that makes them appear rather bestial at times. It's the smart choice though. Their bodies are inherently malleable, and they accept the pain nature gives them as a gift, because to them, usually, there's a silver lining to it. It's all a step on the path to greater power, and with greater power comes greater freedom. Of all the sapient peoples of the Wildsea, the submerged live most harmoniously with nature, though arguably it's hard to describe the nature of the Wildsea as harmonious. They do not fear leviathans, they see them as idols to be emulated, though of course they're not stupid, they know to stay away from them. Crucially, they also know how to stay away from them. They're not, like, explicitly nomadic, they have their burrows and hideouts in the territory that their hunting parties roam. Beautiful little towns at times that you'll never find if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. Their lifestyle is effectively that of sort of mutant hunter-gatherers, and many identify more closely with the beasts of the Wildsea than the wave cutters that roam it, whereas even others don't see a distinction between the wild and the civilized world at all. It's just a different type of ecosystem to them. Though they do live mostly in the tangle and below, there are some who live higher up, and it's more about the mutations and the nature-focused lifestyle. And then there's others who live really deep down, who may not even be aware of the existence of the great wide world out there. And if they were, to be honest with you, it's questionable whether they would even care. Moving on to the origins that don't represent a particular culture, but more of a lifestyle, the Amberclad are people from pre-Verdant times who were caught in the rivers of amber that flooded the world when the iron roots shot up into the heavens. It would have been rivers of sap, really, and then they later become amber. Many of them are perfectly preserved, and they have been frozen in time for centuries. The only thing they've lost is their memories of the lives they had before being chipped out of the amber. It's all just incomprehensible dreams and a sense of nostalgia for a place you're not sure you've ever been to. Amber is rather a ubiquitous material on the Wildsea. People use it as glass, and the techniques for working with it are incredibly sophisticated. Wild sailors regularly find amberclad individuals, and there may be many thousands of them in fields of frozen glass down in the darkness under reefs. As you might imagine, amberclad are quite vulnerable to exploitation, and it's not uncommon for wealthy folks to sort of display still slumbering specimens in their mansions. The next lifestyle is not a lifestyle at all, because the anchored are dead. Yeah, they're ghosts, anchored, as the name suggests, to some sort of physical vessel that gives them a limited material presence in the world. They could be lucky and anchored to some sort of sturdy metal idol, or they could be anchored to a flimsy piece of paper as well. Only a small fraction of people who die with unfinished business become anchored, and maybe some, where all the business is finished, do as well. Ghosts exist on the Wildsea, and anchored are markedly different from them in many ways. They don't seem to be quite the same thing, though what exactly it is that they are, nobody knows. The book actually suggests the idea that they might not be the souls of people at all, but are memories of them taken shape, in which case they might be anchored representing people that never lived in the first place. Some sort of avatar of a concept like revenge or justice or war, maybe a fictional character come to life, that sort of thing. A rather strange one given that you can just play as a mushroom person, but an interesting addition nonetheless. Heartscarvo are non-Gao, or maybe also Gao, that are infected with a symbiotic fungal organism that significantly expands their abilities and gives them access to a telepathic dream net called the Heartscarvo network. Heartscarvos are immensely diverse, but the crucial thing about them is that they are active and enthusiastic hosts for this fungal organism. And though they tend to have some strange habits and character traits, and perhaps sometimes also a propensity for trying to recruit people, there's nothing really that unusual about them in the context of the Wildsea. Okay, no, maybe people do find them a little unsettling. They have, after all, given up a piece of their autonomy. And as diverse as the people of the Wildsea are in appearance, the Heartscarvos are particularly out there. But you know, there are much weirder things as well. You can also just be the parasite. Stowaways are down on their luck people who have no choice but to sneak aboard a ship and hope nobody notices them. Some hop from vessel to vessel and port to port. Others stay on a vessel they have some sort of comfort and routine on for an extended period of time. A lot of ships are pretty big and have plenty of holes and cubbies to stay hidden in, as well as enough supplies to plunder. Many stowaways are orphans or refugees that were never wanted by anyone, so they just assume no one is going to want them here, and risking discovery is not really worth it. Others are spies and couriers of secret information whose job necessitates them traveling the Wildsea without anyone being the wiser. But people like that are very rare indeed. One thing stowaways are not is lazy. It's a very intense lifestyle that requires constant adaptation and alertness. If you're not highly resourceful, you're not gonna make it. Not stowaways, but certainly people who travel a lot, Windward live one life today and another life tomorrow. They hate to be settled down so much that they don't even stick with the same crew for very long. Which isn't to say that they don't love and value the crews that they work with for the time they have together. Windward cherish people so much that they stay in their souls for their whole life. But for them, it's about doing it all, seeing it all, always chasing the next adventure. And as adventurous as a crew might be, there's always routine in there somewhere. And a Windward just doesn't have the time for repeating the same things over and over. It can be a lonely existence. You need to be at peace with yourself, and you might leave a lot of broken hearts in your wake. But you're also going to make a lot of friends and enrich a lot of people's lives. And who knows, there's always people you meet more than once, and maybe one day you'll say, all right, I've seen enough. Time to settle down into my next adventure. Now, all these people, cultures, and lifestyles need to communicate somehow. And the Wildsea takes language as a game mechanic very seriously. They function as skills like any of the other skills. Having skill points in a language implies an understanding not just of like the words and syntax, but also the culture and knowledge that the language is embedded in. So you don't have to be a character that's universally good at swaying people, or a scholar of all cultures, though you certainly can be that. You can specialize in just the ones closest to your life. There are 11 major languages on the Wildsea that you should know about. Low Sour is simple. It's the common of the setting, a sort of trait patois amalgamated from the other languages with a bit of a grammar of its own. Culturally, it represents wild sailors first and foremost, as those are the people who will be speaking it as their main language, but it won't give insight into much else. Chthonic, the language of the earth, is a very diverse, almost sort of linguistic family that is mutually intelligible but comes with vast variance. It's the language of the Ardent as well as the Ketra, who, as you remember, are close cousins to the Ardent in spite of the fact that they look like jellyfish. And like both of these peoples, it descends from the many pre-verdant human languages sort of crunched together because of the events of the Verdancy. Saprec, the language of the Ectus people, is also an ancient pre-verdant language, but not that different from what they spoke back then, given that there's still a handful of pre-verdant Ectus around. Ectus also weren't that numerous before the Verdancy, presumably. Most of them did live in just one area. It's a very sort of substantial language with unexpected subtleties, like fleshy cactus bulbs shaking around in a terracotta jar. Gao Dim, a quiet language compared to various sounds you can produce even if you have no mouth, is built around clicks, wheezes, rips, and splat. And also chemistry, like complex pheromonal bursts, smells, spore compositions, because this is the language of the Gao. Luckily, thanks to the weirdness of the Wildsea, many non-Gao also have the tools to express themselves in it. And for everyone else, there's other chemical aids if you want to go past the simplified grammar. Knock is, frustratingly, not just knocks. It's the language of the TheBurgerkrieg, so it includes multitonal hisses that you'd need multiple mouths or a musical instrument to replicate. Sometimes you also need to contort your body into weird shapes or include scraping sounds of chitin on chitin. But most TheBurgerkrieg won't be mad at you if you lack the swarminess to replicate all that. I like to think that it's basically built around Morse code. Brass tongue, the language of machines, is not dissimilar in that sense. It sort of functions as a colorful extension of binary, and it's not just used by engineers and scholars of ancient computers, but first and foremost by traders. It's a very precise yes or no fuck ambiguity kind of language, which is very useful in like business negotiations across vast distances and cultural lines. Raka Spit, the language of hunters, spoken primarily among like a specific subset of rootless, a very rapid and information-dense language with about 1,000 words for animal and 1,000,000 words for leviathan. Because exchanging information in very little time can be life or death on a hunt, it's streamlined to be spoken quickly, and those who don't speak it well are often at risk of stumbling over their words or misunderstanding more experienced speakers. Lyrebite, a rhythmic tongue that is particularly loose in the words and elements it includes because it's spoken first and foremost by artists, not just to communicate, but to entertain. It's pleasant to listen to even when you don't understand a word of it, and most tavern bards will be singing it, incorporating expressions from other languages to appeal to those cultures, instead of just singing in a different tongue. Old Hand, a language of hands, doesn't do speech at all. It's sign language, plain and simple, not just for the mute and deaf, but for everyone who just doesn't like talking all that much. It's useful when you're trying to stay quiet or communicating over great distances, though there are better options for this. And it's remarkably ancient, carrying many secrets of pre-verdant times. Signaling, the language of ships, a heterogeneous collections of code designed to utilize various shipborne implements like flags, horns, and flares, so ships can talk to each other from far away and relay information across fleets. Most ships on the Wildsea will be flying some kind of passive signal at all times, hopefully just the all clear in the direction we are coming from signal. And finally, Hyven, the Latin of this world, a dead tongue that academics write in to feel smart, very close to various ancient languages, so exceedingly useful if you are going to go around like delving in ancient ruins. A lot of the time, the hazards in there, they're not traps. We characterize them as traps, but they're not. The ancients wrote down exactly like not to go there and what to do there in those situations when they are activated in big letters, because they didn't want anyone to get hurt. There are, of course, more languages and dialects than just these 11, but everyone you meet is gonna speak at least one of them. Probably low sour, so they are by far the predominant tongues. Now, having covered bloodlines and origins, I would be remiss if I didn't get into the third character element, posts, which are essentially the character classes of the Wildsea. However, including the expansion books that I have been able to get my hands on, there's like 30 of them. And though I know you love these long-form videos, we just don't have that kind of time. I do, however, believe that knowing about the posts will give you a lot of insight into the many different ways in which one can be a wild sailor. And perhaps make you perk up a little bit here and there, because I really want you to go out there and play this game. It's caught my attention in ways that few other games have. So I am going to cover them very briefly. The Alchemist is an expert on the manipulation of creserine and other useful substances to create many, often explosive effects. They distill and isolate the base elements of the Wildsea's bounty and recombine it to suit their needs. The Augur intuits knowledge of the surrounding Wildsea and the secrets within through mystical means, usually by reading the stars. This comes with a second sight into the astral world of specters and apparitions, portents of the past, and visions of the future. The Cannoneer follows the impractical pursuit of bringing giant deck weapons to the intimate world of single combat. Their mobility relative to a ship can be very useful when taking down big targets, but their lack of mobility relative to those not laden with giant weapons can be a problem. The Char is the ship's cook. They make meals, take care of provisions, and make sure everyone is in a good mood. Eating a good meal is actually extremely useful and important on the Wildsea, as it can provide a number of arcanautic benefits. The Corsair fights with aggression and distinction, specializing in quick skirmishes and the taking of loot and ships. They sort of swashbuckle a lot, but they carry themselves with a certain military rigor and discipline. The Crash is a smasher, a destroyer, a blow-upper of all things, clearing away obstructions and rendering what's left into useful materials. They don't always work with as much precision as some would like, and the work they do can quickly get out of hand, but no one can deny that they get results. The Diver explores the dark depths of the Wildsea, usually protected only by a diving suit connected with a lifeline to the ship above. They make excellent pathfinders and explorers of submerged structures, but it needs quite an exceptional personality to be able to function in the dark isolation they surround themselves with. The Dredger mines reefs and spelunks all manner of old structures, able to find useful salvage in even the most stripped bare husks. All it takes is one quick jaunt into the dark. They tend to be knowledgeable about everything old, especially pre-Verdant stuff, and have a sixth sense for traps and structural integrity. The Hacker is the mighty warrior that clears away the brush, often posted under the prow of a wave cutter to help clear away nasty vines and branches. They're also fearsome warriors, sort of the barbarian of the setting, except their axes are not axes, but giant fuck-off bone saws. The Horizoneer understands the world as songs and stories, offering and uncovering useful insights in the ideas people choose to express. They value knowledge as much as they value company, and they're often quite skilled, not just adoration, but also with an instrument or two. The Hunter stalks the canopy for prey, tracking, sensing, anticipating. This isn't just about finding food among the branches, it's about honor and the thrill of the chase. They are the foremost experts on hunting rare creatures, and the most dangerous prey of all, leviathans. Not people in this setting. Leviathans are way more dangerous than people. This is not a setting where people are the most dangerous prey. The Kite Sailor takes to the skies, an improvised and sometimes also perhaps not so improvised flying machines, sort of a diver for airships, creating strategic advantages and making their way quickly from A to B. They're not always attached to a ship, though most of them tend to be. Even if you can fly, flying long distances on your own it's dangerous. The Marketeer buys and sells, but also sources and supplies. The economy of the Wildsea is mostly based on barter, and they barter better than anyone. There's a code of honor among Marketeers to keep their word. After all, they are growing an economy, and economies are built on trust. The Mesmer does drugs, and also gives drugs to others, and doing so uncovers the reality hidden beyond reality. They understand the world of dreams. They manifest psychic powers. They don't always do drugs. Drugs are just readily available. Some of them meditate, or seek insights in other ways, but insight they do all very much seek. The navigator understands the geography of the waves and how to decode the countless different types of maps and charts for useful information. They have an almost supernatural understanding of the connections between things, which is essential for wayfinding on the ever-changing Lignan tide. The pilot obviously steers the ship, and they do it with style, grace, and daring. Anyone can hold a rudder, but it takes a pilot to make it sing. They understand the moment to moment of the waves like few others do. They can feel how much a patch of thrash will actually handle, and for how long. The rattle hand makes and repairs, not just machinery, but everything, though machinery tends to offer the most interesting challenges. They are the engineers of the Wildsea, and while everyone can put two things together, they actually get results when they do it. The rattle wing is a type of rattle hand that specializes in flight-related engineering, often flying their own personal little danger machine. They bring a crazy energy that some find disconcerting, while others find it to be the only type of energy you can have if you're going to be serious about reaching beyond. The Raveler is a dervish dancer of sacred cloth, someone who uses fashion as a weapon and gains wisdom and insight from the movement of their body. They are fleet-footed and elegant combatants who dazzle their friends and bewilder their opponents. The Screw masters the art of ferrokinesis, metal magic, enabling them to interact with steel and its many cousins in manifold seemingly impossible ways. They have the powers of Magneto without the stupid helmet. Unless you want the stupid helmet, in which case it should be made out of metal. The Slinger is not just a master of the gun, but a keeper of the peace, a bringer of justice. Sometimes they are the last hope for remote settlements. They bring a Wild West gunslinger type element to the Wildsea, though many of them prefer sniping from a distance or getting very up close and personal with a shotgun. The Smuggler brings things that often don't belong to them to places where not everyone desires them. They fulfill honest needs that people have, just in dishonest ways. And they're not always wrong in doing so. Sometimes they fight tyrants that way. Usually, though, they sort of just line their own pockets. The Steep brews drinks of just the right potency. Their life's work is to extract the essence of all things on the Wildsea and create useful infusions with them. They don't just augment the whole crew's abilities, it's also excellent for morale to have a nice cup of tea after a tough day on the waves. The Surgeon saves lives, and sometimes even makes them better. Wild sailing is hella dangerous, and no one is going to turn up their nose at someone who knows how to patch people up. They usually have an understanding of various different species, not just bloodlines, and how they intersect, given that they are always working with limited resources. The Swarmjack is home to a swarm, usually of insects, that they train and utilize for whatever purpose they are useful for. They come ready for a wide variety of tasks, and they have the many hands needed to get them done expediently. The Tempest is an electrifying presence, a storm mage that communes with the skies, a living battery of pure power, waiting to be unleashed. They tend to have grand personalities, inexhaustible, as though pure energy was coursing through their veins. The Thorn exists in an arguably somewhat undead state, a being melded with greenery, connected to the plants of the Wildsea like few others are. They tend the cycle of decay, reclamation, and growth, speak the language of flowers, and don't worry too much about pain and destruction. The Word-Bearer shoulders the sacred duty of delivering letters and packages from one point to another, no matter the challenge. They scale mountains, ford gaps, brave thugs, and distract the dog in the yard with a big piece of meat. Because delivering every letter is the only thing that matters. The Zealot has seen the bigger picture and understands the cosmic truth that everyone must know about. What exactly that entails, of course, varies from Zealot to Zealot. They seek answers that fit their predefined patterns, and though that should lead nowhere, you'd be surprised how often something is there after all. And that's the classic posts. Not just jobs, but vocations, lifestyles, things that define people beyond just how they earn their wage. Some of them, like the pilots and navigators, you may very much have expected in a game about sailing. Rattlehand is just a funny name for engineer. It's not an unusual archetype though. But I quite like that there's a number of weird manifestations in there as well, that not only provide remarkable powers like the Tempest, but also offer alternative interpretations of classic tropes, like an explicitly plant-themed type of undead. And it's not entirely villainous even, right? It's just an extreme and unusual lifestyle. It's not an evil thing. It very much reinforces the impression that the Wildsea is a very different place to the world that we call home. Now you might sit there thinking, yeah, sure, but if it's just a big ocean of green, does it matter how densely packed with stuff it is when the sheer diversity of that stuff just makes it feel random? I think there's a point to that, even though a well-run game is never going to run into this issue. But it's not actually just a big green ocean. Across the Wildsea, there's a large number of regions where the circumstances and Krezeran mutations make them stand out as truly unique places. We call these regions reaches, and many of them are described as places that may or may not exist in that section of the book, depending on whether or not they would fit into your particular setting. They can act as backdrops for entire campaigns, but they can also be a welcome change of pace from the usual modus operandi of the Wildsea. Force characters who have grown confident in sailing the seas with new and exciting challenges. And of course, because the lore of this game is not definitive, they can act as inspiration for elements you put in your game far outside those reaches, just as elements of the regular boring old ocean of leaves. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to cover all the many reaches that are published to this day. I have mentioned some of them, like the cactus dunes of the Ictarine, or the stone trees of Duzak's Vent. You also have areas like Nadir, where the leaves are instead colorful flower blooms, and tides of insects thrive like nowhere else. The Interregnum, a boreal pine forest where it sometimes snows even in summer, and where ancient automata stalk the forest, masquerading as wild gods. Or Steaming Tsel, a hot and humid jungle laden with fog that houses hidden populations of refugees and where mysterious masks grow on trees. But hang on, you might say. I am a Wildsea expert, I know all the reaches, and for some reason I'm still watching this video, even though I already know everything. Is Steaming Tsel new? Did they put out new reaches that I don't know about? No, actually, I just couldn't help myself. I made my own reach, because you know me, I have to flex my creativity. That's what I do, that's why I do what I do. It is of course just a Google Doc, right? It doesn't have any of the fancy artwork, but Steaming Tsel is a reach you can go look at right now in the description box. And while you're down there, you know, you might also want to check out my novel, Harm's Place. There's also trees in it. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share it to your relevant communities. Consider buying some of my merchandise or my novel, which is new. And it's now standing in front of the short story collection. Discovering the Wildsea was very unexpected for me. It's a very different experience than like researching World of Darkness. In a way, it's simpler, right? There's not hundreds of books and dozens of game lines that exist inconsistently in about like 30 years worth of editions. There's like 2 books and some more add-ons. But to be entirely honest with you, those 2 books could have done with a little more editing. The rules are well explained, most of the book is well worded, and it makes a lot of sense. But there's like a lot of typos, like way more than you would expect for a book that looks this good. Spacing errors, weird layout issues, and there are a few sections that are honestly borderline illegible, because they're so mired in purple prose and convoluted grammatical pirouettes that, you know, they might have been interesting in poetry, but not in a book that seeks to explain something in a somewhat concise manner. I actually sat there screaming at my computer screen sometimes because, like, they described something for a whole paragraph, and by the end of it, I had no idea what it was they were describing. And this isn't just like them having a mysterious and evocative style. Though the fact that a lot of the book is written that way, it doesn't help. They also, especially for the Reaches, do this thing where they just confidently use Mieville-style terminology when talking about things on the Wildsea. But here's the thing. when you read a China medieval novel, it's fine if you don't know what the fuck any of the words mean for the first 100 pages. Figuring that out is part of the experience, and they are very carefully constructed so that eventually it all fits together. You don't necessarily need to know the words at the beginning. But in what is essentially like a travel guide, and certainly a book made for the explicit purpose of conveying information, what happens is that you need to read every section twice. Because in order to understand the section, you need to already know what it says in the section. And that is also no guarantee that you'll understand it. There's also this thing, and I don't know if it's the font they use, but consistently they use M dashes, where they should be using dashes. And I thought I would get used to it, but I never did. It tripped me up every single time. And these books make up a lot of terms, so they use dashes, or rather M dashes, a lot. They literally do the opposite of one another. You cannot interchangeably use these symbols just because they look similar. It is ultimately a very nitpicky critique from me, though. Most of the text, not a problem at all. And the artwork in the book is gorgeous. Also, once again, in stark contrast to World of Darkness, these books are formatted in a way that kind of makes sense. And I can find things when I look for them. I can find them. And that's a luxury I'm not used to. And look, here's the thing. There will be more World of Darkness content. In fact, the next video will be World of Darkness content. Though it's not what you're hoping it is. Some people only want me to make World of Darkness content. I appreciate that they love World of Darkness so much. But the truth is that there's only so much WOD for me to cover. Eventually, I'm gonna run out. Now, I could then make more and more niche and clickbaity content about the setting, but I'm not interested in that. I don't want to blow up big nothing burgers. The channel has always featured a plenitude of content. The RPG content used to be all about Shadowrun. The Wildsea is not going to be the last non-WOD setting that I cover. And I hope that you can not only forgive me for this, but also maybe find some interesting new content for yourself. So in that spirit, check out Steaming Tell and also Harm's Place, and see you around, wild sailors.